September 15th, 1940. Noon. Skies above Victoria Station, London. The air was alive with smoke and sunlight. Far below, Londoners stared skyward as the wail of air raid sirens faded into the background hum of engines. The Battle of Britain had reached its boiling point. From the cockpit of a Hawker Hurricane, Flight Lieutenant Ray Holmes scanned the chaos above the capital. His leather gloves tightened on the control stick, sweat tracing his temples beneath the wool-lined helmet. He flew with number 504 Squadron, and today, the 15th of September, had already earned its place in RAF lore. German bombers streamed across the channel like iron locusts, aiming for London's heart. Below him, columns of smoke drifted above Victoria Station and the palace beyond. The railway lines were visible for only seconds at a time as clouds passed and cleared, casting long shadows across the rooftops. Holmes knew what was at stake. Not just the railway, but the entire symbol of British resilience. Buckingham Palace lay within striking distance of the Luftwaffe's path. He spotted it, a Dornier Do-17, trailing smoke, but still airborne. The bomber was damaged, limping at low altitude, but purposeful. It was heading straight towards central London. Holmes pulled the Hurricane into a shallow dive, angling for interception. He had already fired his 303 Brownings earlier in the sortie, knocking down one bomber north of the Thames. He pulled the trigger again. Click. Nothing. His guns were dry. The situation defied every protocol, every page of training. In the RAF manual, there was no chapter for what to do when your guns run out in mid-combat. You break away. You return to base. That was the rule. But Holmes saw more than a crippled enemy aircraft. He saw a threat still alive, still capable of dropping its deadly payload on civilians, or worse, on the palace itself. What he did next wasn't part of any strategy meeting. It wasn't decided by high command. It came from something deeper. He took a breath, then lined up his plane for ramming speed. The Hurricane surged forward. The sky shrank to a tunnel of aluminum and rivets. Wind buffeted the fuselage. Holmes adjusted his course by mere inches, aiming not for a direct hit, but for the tail section of the Dornier. One wrong move and both planes would be shredded. But Holmes had studied the way aircraft came apart. He aimed for the back, hoping to shear it, not explode. At the moment of impact, there was no dramatic fireball, just a blur of twisted metal, a crunch of force as the Hurricane's right wing struck the Dornier's tail at an angle. The German bomber snapped in midair. Its rear fuselage spiraled toward the rooftops while the front section plummeted with the weight of two engines and a full bomb load. Holmes's plane tore itself apart from the force. The canopy cracked. The control stick spun wildly. The engine died. He was weightless, then falling. He pulled the ripcord. Seconds passed like minutes. Holmes drifted down, half-conscious, a line of blood running into his eye. Below him, smoke pillars twisted into the sky like ghostly fingers. One of the Dornier's engines detonated on impact. A fire broke out near Victoria Station. He landed in a pile of shattered roof tiles, the world swaying as he hit the ground. He had survived. But the war was still roaring overhead. Back at base, mechanics would later find what remained of his Hurricane, what was left of it strewn in 3 separate crash sites across South London. Newspapers the next morning carried his story on the front page. RAF pilot rams enemy bomber to save London. The press called him a hero. Children collected leaflets dropped from the damaged Dornier. Civilians wrote letters praising his bravery. But inside Fighter Command headquarters, the reaction was far more complicated. Senior officers reviewed the combat report in silence. Holmes's act had taken down a bomber, but it had also taken down a British fighter. Some viewed it as reckless. Others quietly saw something else. Because Ray Holmes wasn't the first pilot to run out of ammo mid-fight, and he wouldn't be the last. Somewhere between the unwritten rules of war and the cold math of air combat, a question had started to form. What if ramming wasn't an act of desperation? What if in the right moment it was a tactic? Behind closed doors, senior RAF officials began to look again at pilot reports. They circled terms like accidental collision and last resort maneuver. They noticed a pattern. And so, Without ever appearing in official policy, a new logic took root across the squadrons, not spoken in command briefings, not admitted in public, but passed from pilot to pilot in bunkhouses and hangars. If you've got nothing left, use the airframe. It would never be written down, but it would never be forgotten. July 1940. Early September. RAF stations across southern England. Long before Ray Holmes made headlines over Victoria Station, whispers about ramming already haunted the airfields. Not as orders, not even as suggestions, but as murmurs, the kind of things pilots discussed only after a long sortie, sitting on sandbags, boots off, shirt sleeves rolled, cigarette smoke curling into the gray English sky. You see that Heinkel go down yesterday? Yeah, not from bullets though. He clipped her tail, didn't he? I heard he ran out of ammo. The unspoken truth was, during those long dogfights over Kent and Sussex, ammo ran out far more often than anyone wanted to admit. The 8 Browning machine guns on a Hurricane or Spitfire burned through 303 rounds in less than 15 seconds of continuous fire. That was all a pilot had. 15 seconds to kill, to survive, to protect. Once it was gone, all that remained was nerve and metal. On the 28th of August 1940, Sergeant Dennis Noble of NAM, 609 Squadron was chasing a Dornier when his guns jammed. He veered off, frustrated, and returned to base. That evening, another pilot, Flight Sergeant George Pinkerton of No. 10, 601 Squadron, faced the same situation, but he didn't turn back. With a Heinkel He 111 still flying toward Portsmouth, Pinkerton dove, clipped its wing with his own, and survived the landing. The brass called it an accident. The mechanics, though, weren't fooled. They knew what a clean collision looked like. They could see intention in the angles. This wasn't a pattern yet, not officially, but it was becoming one. Back in London, the Air Ministry received the reports. They never used the word ramming in public. They spoke of emergency contact maneuvers, forced collisions, or simply impact incidents. But in private meetings between fighter command officers, men like Keith Park, Trafford Lee Mallory, and even Dowding himself, the implications were discussed in hushed tones. They asked the same question Holmes would later answer. When every bullet is gone, and a bomber is still flying, what is a fighter pilot supposed to do? For many pilots, it wasn't even a question. It was instinct, especially those who had flown over Dunkirk or watched friends crash into the Channel. If a bomber got through, people died. Every window on that Dornier, or Heinkel, meant another bomb that might flatten a school or tear open a hospital ward. The quiet logic became this: better to sacrifice one fighter than let one bomber through. The geometry of ramming, though, was brutal. This wasn't the clumsy desperation of the Eastern Front, where Soviet pilots in later years would deliberately crash into enemy aircraft with reckless abandon. RAF ramming was surgical, calculated. Pilots began experimenting in the air with non-lethal contact, brushing wings, propeller taps, tail strikes. They knew the difference between a survivable hit and a mutual kill. Aim too far forward, and you clip the engines, triggering explosion. Too central, and you tore both fuselages, instant death. Too far aft, and the bomber might spiral out, but you might not live to see it. The ideal, if there was one, was a high-speed approach from above or behind, slicing a rudder, breaking a tail boom, severing control. It was called decapping, though no one knew where the term came from. A single strike that disabled the bomber without destroying the fighter. Some even tried propeller rakes, shearing through the bomber's control surfaces with their spinning blades. That almost never worked. You'd lose the engine and your own chances of getting home. By September, ground crews began noticing strange patterns in the damage reports. Wingtips missing, but no bullet holes. Propeller blades bent backwards, but engines untouched. Fuselage scrapes, flaps, dented, all without any sign of gunfire. A few senior NCOs joked, "The boys are jousting now." But the tone shifted when one young pilot, Pilot Officer Gerald Warnock, was killed trying to ram a Junkers Ju-88 over Gravesend. He came in too fast, hit the tail dead on, and both aircraft exploded. Warnock never bailed. His body was found still in the cockpit, embedded in the ruins of a burned-out greenhouse. Afterward, his squadron leader held a meeting. No reprimand, no official change in tactics. But no one said, "Don't do it either." It was a silent understanding. If the skies demanded it, ramming was tolerated. Not encouraged, not rewarded, but accepted. That silence created a strange kind of code. Pilots who had done it rarely spoke about it, except to each other. Mechanics quietly patched up bent hurricanes and never asked questions. And in the debrief tents, intelligence officers learned not to push too hard when a pilot claimed, "I just got too close." Ray Holmes didn't invent the idea. He gave it a face, a name, a newspaper headline. But by the time his story hit the front page, ramming had already been tested, tried, and in the eyes of many airmen proven. It was a tactic born of necessity, not strategy. Not yet. September 16, 31,940. RAF, Uxbridge and Air Ministry Headquarters, London. The morning after Ray Holmes's collision, the skies over London remained uneasy. Smoke still curled from shattered buildings. Rescue crews dug through rubble. But inside RAF command posts and briefing rooms, the talk was not about victory. It was about paperwork and silence. Ray Holmes filled out Form 765C, the standard post-sortie combat report, with a battered hand, his script jagged from the bruises that came with parachuting through fire and glass. He listed the Dornier's heading, altitude, weather, and damage. But in the section titled Ammunition Expenditure, he paused. He left it blank. Back at Fighter Command Headquarters in Bentley Priory, Air Vice Marshal Keith Park read the summary aloud to his intelligence staff. No ammunition remaining. Pilot elected to disable enemy aircraft by physical contact. A long silence followed. One staff officer finally spoke. "That's not in any manual." Park didn't reply. Instead, he underlined one sentence. "Target disintegrated, following controlled wing to tail contact. Own aircraft rendered unflyable." Then he circled the word, "controlled." It wasn't that the Air Ministry didn't understand what Holmes had done. They understood too well. The newspapers turned Holmes into a symbol of grit. Photographers snapped his portrait in a borrowed RAF tunic with a hastily wrapped bandage around his head. BBC Radio aired a brief segment, calling him the pilot who knocked a bomber out of the sky with nothing but courage. But at Whitehall, senior officials weren't interested in courage. They were worried about precedent. Behind closed doors, Group Captain John Willoughby de Broke, a rising figure in the air staff, drafted a memo marked, "Confidential, internal only." It asked a troubling question. To what extent is contact interception being utilized in lieu of ammunition-based destruction? The answer wasn't pretty. By the end of September, intelligence officers had logged 6 confirmed ramming events across different squadrons, only one of which had been labeled accidental. The rest had been explained as last resort maneuvering, collision while shadowing, or simply lost contact in low visibility. But the damage told the truth. Wing spars broken clean, starboard ailerons missing, engine cowling intact, but prop tips bent backward, the exact markers of deliberate physical contact. The problem, from the Air Ministry's perspective, was this. If they officially condoned ramming, they would be acknowledging it as a tactical method. And if they acknowledged it, they'd have to explain it to the press, to Parliament, and worst of all to the families of dead pilots. So they chose omission. No training, no doctrine, no memos entre squadrons. Instead, the concept became a kind of institutional ghost, real enough to influence behavior, but never officially alive. In squadron dispersal huts across the country, junior pilots swapped stories. "Did you hear what Holmes did?" "Yeah, clip the Dornier's tail, right? Would you do it?" Most answered with a shrug. "If I had to." Some said no. Not worth it. One bomber for one fighter, not great odds. But for those who had seen London burn, who had heard the bombs fall on Coventry, Portsmouth, and Liverpool, the math was changing. A German bomber could carry 2,000 pounds of high explosives. One direct hit could gut a hospital. One near miss could collapse a school. In that context, Sacrificing a single hurricane or even a Spitfire wasn't just acceptable, it was moral. And so an unspoken formula began to form. Ramming equals last option, but not forbidden. Meanwhile, engineers at Farnborough, reviewing crash reports, began quietly modeling the physics of ramming without ever calling it that. They created diagrams of impact vectors, fuselage stress tolerances, wingtip deflection angles. These weren't circulated widely, but they existed. A chart produced in October 1940 showed that a Hurricane Mach-I could withstand a 15 degrees glancing impact at 250 miles per hour without structural failure, assuming a tail strike. Another showed how the Dornier Do 17's rudder assembly sheared easily under downward force, the same strike Holmes had executed. These were not coincidences. They were unofficial data for an unofficial tactic. At the Churchill Archives in Cambridge, letters from Air Ministry officials show growing discomfort. One file dated the 3rd of October 1940 includes this typed note: "We must not, under any circumstances, create the impression that our pilots are being asked to commit suicide." Holmes's actions were commendable, but not reproducible. This is not to become policy. And yet, it did. In practice, not on paper. By the end of the month, pilots in at least 4 squadrons had practiced what they called passive contact maneuvers, approaches designed to simulate a tail strike without actual collision. In No. 250, 616 Squadron, Flight Lieutenant James Leithart logged a sortie in which he approached Heinkel bomber from below, intended contact, but enemy broke off. That note was buried deep in his personal diary, now held at the Imperial War Museum. Even veteran aces began to comment in code. In a September letter from Douglas Bader to fellow pilot Hugh Dundas, Bader wrote, "Running dry over the coast, might have gone the Holmes route. Lined him up, but Jerry dove out." The Holmes route. That's what they were calling it now. October 1940, Southern England, RAF sector stations. The idea wasn't spoken aloud in briefings. It wasn't written in black ink on chalkboards or tucked into training manuals. But it was spreading. "Don't aim for the fuselage. You'll kill both of you." That bit of advice came from a flight sergeant at Tangmere, muttered casually over a mug of lukewarm tea after a dawn patrol. The others in the dispersal hut nodded, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. They'd all heard it somewhere before. What began as a desperate improvisation ramming was slowly taking on a different form. Pilots weren't throwing their aircraft into full-speed collisions. They were adapting, learning how to hit without dying. They called it kissing the tail. The idea was simple in theory and terrifying in practice. Close the distance to the enemy bomber without firing. Approach from above or the side, and use your own aircraft to shear off just enough of the target's control surface to send it spiraling without destroying yourself in the process. The execution required precision, nerve, and luck. Over at RAF Biggin Hill, a small group of Hurricane pilots began informally practicing interception passes on returning friendly aircraft. After confirming with ground control, they would make mock approaches, flying up behind older Blenheim bombers or Tiger moths, coming within inches before breaking away. It was unofficial. No one signed off. But ground crewmen began to notice the growing frequency of chipped wingtips, cracked navigation lights, and scuffed fuselage paint. Bird strikes, some pilots claimed with a wink. They knew better. One of the earliest survivors of a clean tail strike was Pilot Officer Malcolm Stoner, flying with No. 603 Squadron. On October 12th, during a late afternoon sortie near the Thames estuary, he ran dry after expending all his ammunition chasing a Heinkel He-111. He later wrote in his log, "Approached from high 6 o'clock. No evasive movement. Calculated trajectory. Nudged left rudder. Made contact with enemy tail fin using port wing. Bomber lost control. Dove shallow. Parachutes observed. Own aircraft vibrating badly, but controllable. Landed without flaps." That final line, "landed without flaps," meant he brought the plane home despite a partial wing failure. Stoner's success passed like wildfire through neighboring squadrons. At RAF Duxford, mechanics began quietly reinforcing the outer wing spars of certain Hurricanes with heavier rivets, calling it structural maintenance. No official explanation followed, but pilots started asking to fly Stoner wings. especially on days when bomber formations were expected. There was no formal training program, but there was a growing body of knowledge, passed hand to hand, hangar to hangar. Some tactics emerged. Angle of attack. The ideal approach was a 15 to 20 degree downward vector, any steeper, and the impact would drive the fighter into the bomber's engines. Too shallow, and you'd risk grazing the dorsal gunner's canopy. Speed management. Contact had to occur just below stall speed around 200 to 220 miles per hour to preserve structural integrity. But if the bomber was descending or turning, that margin narrowed dangerously. Target zones. Pilots aimed for 3 key locations: the vertical stabilizer, the rudder hinge, or the rear elevator. These were critical for flight control, but relatively fragile. One strike could disable maneuverability without destroying the aircraft. Exit strategy. After contact, a sharp roll and dive was essential to break away cleanly. The longer the fighter lingered near the bomber's wake, the higher the risk of losing control or being struck by debris. Not all attempts ended well. Flight Lieutenant Harold Kent of No. 72 Squadron tried to clip a Junkers Ju-88 over Canterbury in mid-October. He misjudged the descent rate. His Hurricane's propeller caught the top of the bomber's dorsal fin, and the impact shattered his reduction gear. The engine seized instantly. Kent bailed out, landing in a sheep pasture with a broken collarbone. The bomber, however, kept flying, limping back to Calais with a scorched tail and 2 dead gunners. Kent never tried it again, but others did. Over the next 3 weeks, at least a dozen more encounters bore the hallmarks of controlled contact. Most remained undocumented in official reports. But the pattern grew clear. What began as a desperate move was becoming in something else. A shadow technique, half taught, half learned. In private journals and letters, pilots described it as both terrifying and beautiful. The calm it required in the chaos. The silence in your ears as you eased closer. The flash of sunlight off enemy aluminum just before the hit. And the jolt not like an explosion, but like hitting a cricket bat mid-swing. Sharp, brief, jarring. For some, that moment became more memorable than any gunnery kill. Back at the Air Ministry, correspondents showed unease. One note from late October, buried in a routine administrative file, contained a line that said, "There are troubling indications that a form of physical interception is becoming ritualized. While we admire initiative, such actions risk encouraging self-destruction among young officers." But those words never reached the hangars. In the sky, where seconds meant lives, and one bomber slipping through could erase a neighborhood, the calculus was different. There were no medals for wing strikes, no confirmed kills on the board, no broadcast interviews for the ones who missed. But within the squadrons, among those who flew and fought together, these acts earned something rarer: respect. The 19th of November, 1940, West Midlands, England. The city of Birmingham shuddered beneath a cold, cloudless sky. It was the industrial heart of Britain, factories pounding out tank armor, aircraft parts, and munitions by the ton. To the Luftwaffe, it wasn't just a target, it was a priority. By mid-November, German High Command had shifted its night bombing campaign to cripple inland production. Coventry had already burned. Now came Birmingham's turn. Shortly before dusk, over 440 bombers crossed the channel. Many were Heinkel He, 111 seconds, backed by fast-moving Junkers Ju, 88 seconds. They came in waves, climbing over the Cotswolds, spreading out as they approached the city's outer ring of lights. Searchlights caught them, ensnaring white fingers. Flak towers thundered, and high above, RAF fighters scrambled, too few, too late. Among them was Pilot Officer Colin Sharp of No. 605 Squadron, flying his battered Hurricane on just 2 hours' notice. He'd been on leave, hadn't even eaten since morning. But the call had come through. Raid over Birmingham. Get up now. At 14,000 feet, he caught sight of a Dornier formation cruising with deadly calm. He picked his target, a straggler lagging behind with its starboard engine smoking. Closing fast, Sharp fired. A short burst. Missed. He adjusted. Tried again. Click. Empty. A choice lay before him. And he didn't hesitate. He banked hard and dove not recklessly, but with the strange, focused quiet of a man who's already made up his mind. He angled toward the Dornier's tail and aimed for the elevator, the thin surface at the rear. Just enough to throw the bomber into instability. Impact came sharp and fast. His wingtip clipped clean through the rudder. The bomber lurched, spiraled, then dropped like a broken toy. A flare of fire bloomed on the horizon. Sharp's Hurricane didn't fare well either. The impact had bent his wing spar and jammed his ailerons, but he managed a rough landing in a muddy field outside Solihull. Locals rushed to help him from the wreckage. He was bleeding from the forehead, dazed, but walking. That night, the bombers rained destruction down on Birmingham. Nearly 500 civilians were killed. Entire streets vanished beneath cratered stone and fire. But at least one bomber, maybe two, hadn't made it through. And in the squadrons that followed, more and more pilots began flying with a mental option 3 in mind. Shoot first, chase second, and if all else fails, clip the tail. Back at RAF Wittering, Flight Lieutenant Andrew Forbes gathered his flight for a quiet chat after evening chow. The mess hall was dim, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the distant rumble of returning patrols. "We're not going to pretend anymore," he said. "You all know what Sharp did. You know what Holmes did. And you've probably seen the damage on Ledhart's kite from Tuesday." He paused, looked around at the young faces, most of them barely 20, cheeks still speckled with razor burn, shoulders tight with fatigue. "I'm not telling you to ram, no one is. But if you have to, aim clean, hit light, get out." He drew a quick sketch in chalk on the wall. A silhouette of a Heinkel, then a dotted line coming down across the tail. "Here, never center, never nose, never engines, just this." He tapped the rudder with his knuckle. "If you miss, you dive. If you hit, you peel off. No glory in it. Just doing what has to be done." That talk wasn't recorded, but every man in that room remembered it. The Birmingham raids changed something. Not because they were the worst. Coventry had seen more fire, London more terror, but because they proved that inland cities were no safer than the coast, and that Britain's factories were just as vulnerable as its homes. Commanders began issuing unofficial notes. "Do not discourage evasive contact if no ordnance remains. Any confirmed downing that protects population centers to be marked as mission success." Even the language shifted. Pilots no longer said they rammed. They said they disabled or disrupted. Mechanics began carrying extra wing spars and tail assemblies, expecting contact damage as part of routine repair. At Filton, engineers noticed a spike in repair requests for the same type of structural harm: bent flaps, torn trailing edges, deformed aileron housings. When asked, squadrons attributed it to aggressive maneuvers. No one asked further, but in the skies, every bomber that didn't reach its target was counted. Everyone knocked down, whether by gunfire or glancing strike, gave a family one more day, a neighborhood one more night of peace. And in that desperate calculus of war, ramming became less of an act of madness and more of a tool. Not public, not trained, but known. And on dark, frozen mornings across the countryside, pilots tucked the idea into the back of their minds, like a lucky charm they hoped they'd never need but kept all the same. December 1940. Air Ministry Headquarters, London. The fires in Birmingham had barely cooled when a courier delivered a stack of damage reports to the Air Ministry's war room. Among the usual sheets of sortie counts, aircraft losses, and flak damage was a short note attached to a combat report from number 605 Squadron. The final line read, "Contact made with enemy tail assembly after ammunition expended. Result, bomber disintegrated. Own aircraft sustained manageable damage. Pilot recovered." It was a dry line, technical, no emotion, no drama, but it carried weight. Air Vice Marshal Sholto Douglas read it twice, said nothing, and slid it into a folder already thick with similar phrases. Collision during interception. Contact made during maneuver. Impact following pursuit. None of them said rammed. And that was intentional. To admit that Royal Air Force pilots were ramming bombers, even under extreme conditions, raised uncomfortable questions. For one, it suggested that the RAF had failed to supply enough ammunition or intercepting aircraft to stop the Luftwaffe the traditional way. It hinted at desperation. Even worse, it opened the door to accusations of reckless endangerment of British pilots, young men the nation could not afford to lose. So the official policy remained silence. No broadcast would mention it. No manual would teach it. No squadron would be formally recognized for it. It was, in every official capacity, an aberration, something to be corrected, not encouraged. And yet, in December 1940 alone, 7 verified cases of tailstrike ramming were quietly logged by Fighter Command staff officers. They saw the pattern, but their orders were clear: suppress the narrative. Behind the curtain, however, dissent grew. In the Fighter Command Tactical Memorandum, Air 16/1222, dated December 12th, a paragraph was inserted, then crossed out before publication. In exceptional cases where ordnance is no longer available and strategic targets remain unneutralized, physical interception may be attempted using calculated airframe contact, provided the preservation of the pilot is statistically probable. The language was clinical. It was almost legalistic. And it was never sent. The red line that crossed it out wasn't just ink. It was fear. Fear of backlash from Parliament, from grieving families, from the global press. The RAF had cultivated an image of calm professionalism. It did not want stories of pilots using their planes like medieval lances in the skies over England. Inside Churchill's wartime cabinet, the Prime Minister had a different view. Winston Churchill admired boldness, and though he never publicly spoke about the ramming tactic, a handwritten note in his personal diary dated December 18th reads, "Young Holmes, guts beyond the horizon. We may need more of that kind of madness if the storm worsens." But madness was a dangerous word to put in policy. The RAF command chain walked a fine line. Pilots were praised for extraordinary resolve under fire, and their combat reports were quietly padded with non-specific phrases like enemy aircraft destroyed by aggressive pursuit. The nature of the destruction was never probed too deeply. At the RAF Museum in Hendon, technical reports from damaged hurricanes during December 1940 show unusual repair patterns. Multiple aircraft returning with damage to the same section of the right wing, bent outboard spars, and flaking paint traced with fragments of aluminum not matching RAF paint codes. That paint, it turned out, was Luftwaffe gray. And still, the ministry said nothing. Even within the squadrons, there were mixed feelings. Some senior officers, particularly those who'd flown in the Great War, disapproved of the tactic. To them, ramming carried the scent of panic, not professionalism. They believed aerial warfare was meant to be precise, clean lines, smooth dogfights, disciplined engagements. "You fight with bullets," one wing commander was overheard saying, "not with desperation." But the younger pilots, the ones flying every day, losing friends weekly, saw it differently. They weren't suicidal. They weren't reckless. They were adapting. Ramming, when done right, wasn't chaos. It was control at the edge of destruction. At RAF Debden, a meeting between squadron leaders in late December revealed how far the idea had spread. One leader proposed an informal training rotation, not to teach ramming, but to educate pilots on close pursuit geometry and emergency proximity maneuvering. Everyone in the room knew what that meant. None of them wrote it down. Meanwhile, political pressure increased. Civilian casualty numbers were rising again. Bomber Command was retaliating in kind, but the fear that German bombers might soon return in larger numbers was ever present. If the public caught wind that pilots were sacrificing their own aircraft by design, the narrative could spiral out of control. So, the RAF doubled down on the myth of gunfire. Every bomber downed was reported as a kill by bullets, even when the final strike had come from steel on steel. Even Ray Holmes, now quietly reassigned to non-flying duties, found himself excluded from official after-action briefings. His name disappeared from dispatches. He'd done his job. But he was not to be made a model. The government had learned its lesson from the Holmes story a bit too well. The press had seized on the heroism, but it opened too many doors, too many questions. The public image of the RAF needed to remain clean, calculated, glorious, not scarred. And so, even as more pilots clipped tails, severed rudders, and dove away smoking and bleeding into hedgerows across the countryside, the official records stayed vague. The tactic lived on, but only in whispers. January 1941. Dispersal huts, flight lines, and pub back rooms across southern England. It was never written on a blackboard, never outlined in a lecture. But across the RAF, the knowledge passed from mouth to mouth, a new kind of lesson, taught in glances, jokes, and sketches drawn on mess hall napkins. They called it the Holmes method. Not in mockery, but in quiet reverence. To say you'd used it meant you'd gotten close, too close, that you'd faced a choice most never wanted to face and lived. It began informally, always in the downtime, between sorties, after night patrols. When the adrenaline wore off and pilots sat with tin mugs of tea or chipped enamel cups of whiskey, the stories came out. You line up just under their tailplane, angle 5 degrees off the axis, aim for the rudder, not the fin. Don't touch the fuselage, too much mass. You'll rip your own wing off. Use the aileron edge. It's flexible. You'll shear his tail before yours gives out. At RAF Northolt, a pair of pilots from one squadron, one Scottish, the other from Lancashire, began a peculiar drill. After maintenance checks were complete, they'd take off in tandem, climb to 8,000 feet, and practice shadowing each other at dangerously close distance. No one told them to do it. No one stopped them either. They called it ghosting. In these exercises, one pilot would mimic a bomber's steady cruise while the other stalked from behind, creeping closer, adjusting pitch and throttle to maintain a distance of less than 10 feet. They'd hold that position for as long as nerves allowed before peeling away. Then they'd switch roles. They never logged the practice, never mentioned it in briefings. But within weeks, other pilots were joining. At night, chalk drawings appeared on hangar walls, crude diagrams of tail assemblies, circles showing optimal contact zones, even step-by-step sketches of how to bank after a strike. It looked like schoolboy graffiti to most, but the pilots knew better. They were building a library, a hidden syllabus. At RAF Warmwell, one flight commander instructed his newest pilots to study hurricane structural schematics during their off hours. When asked why, he replied, "Just know what'll break first if you have to get too close." That was all he said. No explanation, no context. And they understood perfectly. Even in pubs, particularly the Red Lion near Kenley and the George outside Biggin Hill, the tactic had entered common conversation. Pilots would nudge salt shakers and cigarette boxes across tabletops, demonstrating angles and strike points using whatever was within reach. "You see this?" one would say, tipping over a shot glass to mimic a falling heinkel. "That's what happens if you clip the tail just right. But if you catch the gunner's turret mate, you're both toast." They didn't speak like strategists. They weren't theorists. These were men who had seconds to make choices no manual could prepare them for. They were boiling their experiences down to instincts, muscle memory, survival tricks. Word spread even faster among ground crews. Mechanics at Tangmere began reinforcing outboard wing panels during routine inspections, not because of any official order, but because they'd seen too many planes come back with torn wingtips and bent ribs. They used extra rivets, subtle adjustments, no paperwork. At Hawking, one NCO was overheard telling a young corporal, "When they come back like that, don't log it as flak damage. Just write operational stress. It keeps the officers quiet." It became a culture of winks and coded phrases. Operational stress, unconventional contact, the long reach. No one said ramming. That word was still taboo, a sign of desperation or madness. But everyone knew what was happening. Even pilots who'd never made contact began rehearsing it mentally. Some confessed to dreaming about it. The approach, the wobble of the enemy's tail in the crosshairs, the split-second judgment of distance and angle, the jolt and the prayer. It wasn't heroism they were chasing. It was control away to take back power when all other tools had failed. Some squadrons developed signals, a radio click, a wing waggle, a certain way of banking near the target to show intention. If a pilot planned to attempt the Holmes method, they wanted their squadron mates to know just in case they didn't come back. One account, taken from the personal diary of Flight Officer Jeremy Knox, tells of a mission over Bristol Channel in January 1941. I'd burned through all I had. Dornier's still moving east. I gave the boys a slow left roll before I went in just once. McAvoy saw it. He knew. When I clipped the rudder, I swear I felt nothing at all. Just wind. Then the bomber dropped. I dove hard, made it home on fumes, told no one. By February, pilots from Polish and Czech squadrons, fierce flyers with their own scars and scars to be had, adopted the method as well. They brought their own touch, tighter turns, more aggressive impact angles. They had less to lose, and they flew like it. Still, the RAF never officially acknowledged any of it. No commendations were awarded for contact kills. No press statements were released. No updates were made to the Fighter Command tactical briefings. But everyone knew. The Holmes method had taken root not in policy, but in practice. And each time a bomber dropped from the sky without a bullet fired, the silence around the act grew deeper, more respected, more necessary, more permanent. February, March 1941, skies over Britain, fields below. There was no scoreboard for it, no chalk tally on briefing room walls. But its effects could be seen in bombers that didn't make it, in civilians who lived to see morning, in the narrow margin between burning factories and standing ones. By early 1941, an estimated 35 German bombers had been brought down by physical contact, according to internal RAF assessments that were never made public. Of those, over 24 were classified as losses without primary gunnery kill confirmation, which was bureaucratic shorthand for what everyone already knew. They'd been rammed, some by design, some by sheer necessity. Flight Officer Harold Dean was one of the lucky ones. In mid-February, he was chasing a Ju-88 over the outskirts of Sheffield when his ammo ran dry. He chose the Holmes method, climbed above the bomber, nosed over, and clipped the tail with the leading edge of his wing. He survived the strike. The bomber didn't. The Ju-88 fell in pieces over a railway yard, its payload never released. That night, a munitions train pulled into the station unharmed. Local newspapers reported the success of Britain's air defenses, but never mentioned how close they came to losing the entire depot. Harold was grounded for 2 weeks for fatigue. He never admitted what really happened, but the maintenance report on his Hurricane told the story: fractured wing rib, embedded aluminum fragments, and scraped gray paint that didn't match any RAF color code. Other pilots weren't as fortunate. Squadron leader Ellis Jack Markham attempted a similar maneuver over Southampton. Eyewitnesses said his Spitfire approached too steeply. Instead of striking the tail, he caught the edge of the bomber's right engine nacelle. Both aircraft exploded mid-air, a double loss. Markham had 3 confirmed kills before that flight. His wingmen held a short, silent toast for him that night. No one mentioned the word ramming. They just raised their glasses. Here's to Jack, and let the silence fill the room. Behind these individual stories were thousands of civilian lives that never knew how close death had come. In Liverpool, on March 5th, a lone Dornier peeled away from a formation after its controls failed mid-flight. It crashed harmlessly in a field just outside the city limits. A single Hurricane was seen diving away moments before its right wing visibly damaged, trailing smoke. That pilot was never identified. No one filed a claim for that kill. But across Liverpool that night, mothers tucked their children into beds that still had roofs. The dockyard workers returned for another shift. The hospitals remained standing. Each of these moments mattered, and each came at a cost. Even when pilots survived the hit, they often paid for it in months, not days. Their bodies bruised from the jolt, fingers broken against the control stick. One pilot, Flight Officer Benjamin Rowe, lost hearing in one ear after the force of impact knocked his headset clean off and sent him spiraling into a flat spin before recovery. He landed safely, but he never flew again. Psychologically, too, the toll crept in. These weren't clean kills. not like a burst of machine gun fire from 500 yards, watching an engine trail smoke as the enemy banked away. Ramming was up close, visceral. You saw the crew, sometimes their eyes, their panic, their final seconds. Some pilots swore they made contact without ever seeing a soul inside the bomber. Others weren't so lucky. Flight Lieutenant Peter Dunsmore wrote in his diary, "I saw the rear gunner looking right at me. He was young, could have been 20. I don't think he fired. I don't think he moved. Just looked. Then I clipped the tail and peeled off. I saw the bomber spin. I don't know if they got out." It haunted him for months. But ramming wasn't just a physical act. It was a mental commitment, a contract with fate that said, if this is how it ends, so be it. But I'm taking you with me. And for those who survived, they carried the memory like a second set of wings. Still, the cost was measurable. Of the estimated 40 pilots who attempted ramming or tail strike actions between September 1940 and March 1941, at least 11 were killed, 17 were injured, and 4 were permanently grounded due to aircraft damage or medical issues. That left less than a dozen who returned to full combat duty unscathed. Was it worth it? The answer depended on who you asked. For the pilots who watched entire squadrons of bombers unload over their hometowns, yes. For the ground crews who patched up Hurricanes and Spitfires with salvaged parts, maybe. For the senior officials who scanned the casualty reports they'd never say out loud. And for the families in Coventry, Birmingham, and Liverpool who didn't wake up to rubble. They never knew the names of the men who made sure of that. But they lived because of them. April-May 1941, Fighter Command Headquarters, Public Information Office, and Squadron Briefing Rooms. In the months that followed the height of the bomber raids, a strange contradiction settled over Fighter Command like low fog across a runway. Everyone knew the truth, but no one spoke it in full. Ramming, or as it had come to be referred to in cautious circles, proximity disablement, had quietly changed the way the war was fought in the skies above Britain. Yet to the outside world, the RAF's image remained frozen in place, disciplined, mechanical, surgical, a force of cool heads and clean kills. Dogfights were for posters, machine guns for press releases. Pilots, they said, shot bombers out of the sky with calm precision, returning home to tea and applause. The reality was different, more raw, more desperate. Inside briefing rooms, squadron leaders gave quiet nods to the tactic. They'd say things like, "Do what you must," or "Bring it down no matter what." But the official documents stayed blank on the matter. At Fighter Command HQ, planners and clerks continued logging confirmed kills with standardized categories: machine gun fire, cannon fire, shared kill, and damage sustained in combat. No field for physical contact. No space for intentional ramming. Even the pilots who had done it more than once were expected to hold their tongues. Flight Officer Malcolm Stoner, one of the earliest men to survive and repeat the maneuver, was called to a debriefing in early April. His reports had become increasingly detailed diagrams of approach vectors, notes on airframe response after impact, down to the number of degrees his aileron twisted post-strike. Instead of praise, he received a warning. "Your documentation is excessive," said a wing commander in a gray pressed uniform, flipping through the report like it was radioactive. "We don't want to encourage misinterpretation of tactics." Stoner nodded. He never wrote another diagram again. The problem wasn't just public perception, it was the RAF's internal mythology. From its founding, the Royal Air Force had cultivated a code of gentlemanly warfare, precision, control, chivalry in the clouds. Its pilots were not kamikazes. They were professionals. Its doctrine was built on the clean application of force, not improvisation at the edge of death. Ramming didn't fit that model. It smacked of chaos. It made pilots seem like cornered animals, brave, yes, but desperate. And desperation wasn't something high command wanted to advertise in spring 1941, when public morale was hanging by threads and Britain's allies were watching closely. So the silence grew thicker. Propaganda films, narrated with the smooth baritone of wartime announcers, showed RAF fighters gliding through flak to pick off bombers with ease. No footage of shattered wing panels, no mention of metal-on-metal collision. The Air Ministry released stylized illustrations to newspapers, Spitfires in clean formations, Heinkels erupting in flame mid-air, tracer lines painted across the sky like fireworks. It was theater. Behind the curtain, pilots knew better. In number 616 Squadron, a pilot named Harry Linton flew 6 combat sorties in April. On his third, he used the Holmes method on a Ju-88 crossing the Wash. On his 6th, he did it again. Both kills were listed in his file as aggressive pursuit, likely structural failure of enemy aircraft. He received a promotion and a ribbon, but no mention of contact. Linton's wing commander later admitted, years after the war, "We knew what Harry was doing. Everyone did. We just didn't write it down. Not because it wasn't honorable, but because it didn't fit." And that became the RAF's quiet policy. Let the tactic live, but outside the books. Let the pilots teach each other. Let the ground crews patch up the damage. Let the truth spread in silence, like an unwritten scripture, but never say it out loud. Some in the Air Ministry feared it could become a habit, that once ramming became acceptable, even unofficially, it would lead to a breakdown of discipline. They worried young pilots would take unnecessary risks, driven by glory or desperation. But those same officers also read the casualty reports. They saw how many bombers were dropping short of their targets. They read the stories, or at least the parts that weren't censored, of munitions, plants saved, rail depots untouched, hospital wards spared. They couldn't deny the effect, so they preserved the myth. A myth where every bomber was stopped with bullets. A myth where every kill was clean. A myth where heroes didn't need to break the rules because the rules were always enough. And the pilots? They played along. For the most part. But late at night, when the radios were off and the hangars quiet, they still told the stories. Still drew the sketches. Still nodded knowingly when someone said they were getting close during a sortie. Because they knew something the public didn't. Fighter Command was fighting with more than just firepower. They were flying on grit, on instinct, on the split-second decision to use a 10,000-pound aircraft like a battering ram, not for glory, not for medals, but because there was simply no other choice, and they did it knowing they'd never be praised for it, only remembered by those who were there. June 1941, and beyond, from squadrons to silence. By the summer of 1941, the tide had begun to turn. The Luftwaffe's concentrated raids on Britain slowed. Hitler's attention shifted eastward, toward the vast expanse of the Soviet Union. The Blitz, though far from forgotten, had entered its final phase. And with it, the story of aerial ramming, the desperate, precise, brutal tactic of steel meeting steel, began to fade. Not because it was no longer needed, but because the RAF no longer wanted to remember. As the chaos of 1940 gave way to the grinding, more organized rhythm of a global war, the Royal Air Force tightened its doctrine, its language, and its image. The war had become a story of machines and strategies. There was little room left for unsanctioned tactics whispered in hangars or passed around in pubs. The Holmes method, once a ghost strategy shared between pilots, was quietly buried under layers of new training standards, aircraft upgrades, and the growing reliance on radar and ground control. Pilots entering service in late 1941 or early 42 weren't taught the tactic. They weren't warned about it. They simply never heard about it. It became folklore if it was mentioned at all. Older veterans, especially those who had fought during the Battle of Britain, carried it like a secret, something between a memory and a wound. Some mentioned it only once, often years later, when no one was listening. Flight Officer Raymond Coster, in a taped interview decades after the war, was asked what moment stuck with him most during the Blitz. He answered, "You know, I once brought down a Dornier with my wing. Just clipped it. Got too close. It felt like hitting a tree branch with your arm at full sprint. You don't feel pain, just the jolt. But the bomber broke first. Never told anyone but the mechanic. That mechanic, unnamed, had scribbled, 'Unusual contact damage, cause not determined,' in the repair log. And that was the last written trace. Historians, decades later, combing through microfilm at Kew and Hendon, found fragments redacted combat reports, repair sheets with odd structural bends, first-hand diaries locked away in family trunks. They found enough to know it happened, but not enough to prove it was taught, or sanctioned, or real in the way official history demands. It was, and remains, a missing chapter not because of lack of impact, but because it didn't fit the narrative the RAF and Britain wanted to remember. Heroic, yes. Efficient, no. Ramming was messy. It didn't speak of mastery. It whispered of survival. In the post-war years, as war films became Britain's second memory, the pilot archetype solidified, unshakable, focused, precise. Not a man willing to rip the tail off a bomber with his own wingtip. That felt reckless, dangerous. Yet in truth, it was those very men who had helped keep the lights on during the darkest nights of 1940 and 1941. Men like Ray Holmes, the name everyone remembered, even if they didn't know why. Holmes went on to serve in intelligence. He rarely spoke of his ramming again, though he lived into his 90 seconds. When interviewed on the subject late in life, he simply said, "I had no bullets left. It was the only thing I could do." That was it. Not a boast, not a legend, just a choice. And it was that kind of choice that shaped those early days of the war, 1,000 small, forgotten decisions made by men who didn't wait for permission to act when it mattered. In the decades that followed, ramming would appear in other conflicts. The Soviets famously employed it during the defense of Moscow. The Japanese later pushed it to extremes with their kamikaze doctrine, something far more terrifying and final. But the RAF, they never endorsed it, never studied it, and never repeated it after 1941. Not officially. And so, it faded. Disappearing not because it failed, but because it succeeded quietly, too quietly for the mythmakers. Too raw for the history books, too human for the headlines. But in those lonely moments when a pilot sat in the cockpit, watching tracers fade and fuel run low, and saw a bomber limping toward a city that couldn't fight back, that silence became a decision. A roll of the wings, a prayer beneath breath, a collision that never made the news but changed the outcome, all the same.